So welcome back, everybody, and I hope the sunshine is agreeable to you and you've had a lovely sandwich or break, and also maybe just a chance to mull over some of the, I think, quite rich content that we had before the break. I'm going to change tempo a little bit, be a little bit less reflective and prayerful, but still I'd encourage you to have behind, as it were, behind your eyeballs as you engage with what I'm going to say. Just hang on to those insights, those thoughts, because really we're called to integrate, as it were, the sort of intellectual stuff that I might be talking about now with the spiritual that we talked a little bit about before the break. So, although it's a change of tempo, integration is the name of the game. 3 pointers from Pope Francis. So 3 points. Anybody who's ever been to a Jesuit retreat knows that everything comes in 3 points. First of all, Pope Francis says that we are in a single crisis, and I'm going to spell out what he thinks the nub of the hostility is at the moment. And it might surprise you. I hope it does, because I've rather built it up in that way at this stage, so I don't want to disappoint. Secondly, I'm going to talk about learning to discern. It's a word that you've heard a lot about since Pope Francis became Pope. A word often associated with certainly the mystical side of the church, the religious orders, and maybe in a particular way with the Jesuits. Jesuits have been using the word for centuries without really knowing what it means, and they have rows with each other regularly because they disagree. Now the whole church is doing it. So I'm going to tell you what it really means. Yeah, you're right to be sceptical about that, but I will certainly lead you in a little bit of a reflection on what discernment is and why it's so important today in functioning and serving Christ in a hostile environment, which might be a little bit counterintuitive. And then finally, say something about the turn in Catholic social teaching today towards non-violence. That's something you haven't picked up. It's not something we talk about terribly much as a sort of full-on topic, but I want to say something about what Pope Francis actually calls, and rather more evocatively, a revolution of tenderness. Again, as part of our way of dealing with the hostile environment in which our faith is to be lived out today. So those are the 3 points. Let's go gently into the first one. Pope Francis, in Laudato Si, probably his greatest teaching document, I'm sure you've all heard of it, some of you will have read it, all about environmentalism, right? No, it's a Catholic social teaching document which touches in a very detailed and profound way on issues surrounding integral ecology, in other words, the Catholic way of being ecological. It's not principally about environmentalism. This is where I think we fall into a terrible trap all the time of thinking, well, we just have to be environmental, dab a bit of holy water on it, and that's that. That's the Catholic thing. Pope Francis' teaching Laudato Si is an astonishing integral formation in a very, very profound way of re-envisioning human social life. It really is about a revolution in society, a different way of being human and of being a human community. So at least if you take nothing else away from the second half of the talk today, just have that little question in your mind: have I slightly misinterpreted what Laudato Si is all about? I think one of the boldest things in that great encyclical, though, is that Pope Francis names one nub of what I've called the hostility. And I think it's one of the most bold diagnoses in any Catholic document in the last few centuries. It's really quite astonishingly clear. Pope Francis starts by saying, there are a lot of bad things going on in the world. There is environmental catastrophe, we all know that. Some of us are denying it, but, well, okay, that happens. But we know that that's the case. There is a huge political crisis. There's a massive immigration crisis, displaced people all around the world. All sorts of crises, and a number of them. And you could list them and get very depressed about all of them and say, how on earth are we going to deal with all this? Pope Francis's genius, I think, is to say, don't think of them as a shopping list of huge problems that we have to deal with one by one. Think of them as a single crisis, an omni-crisis, which we have to face. And at the heart of it is one particular problem that has cropped up in the last couple of centuries and reached a really critical point today in our lives. The language that he uses is the language of the technocratic paradigm. Immediately, some of you will think, oh yeah, I've heard of that. Immediately, others will think, what on earth is that? I've never heard that before. What? And I don't even know what those words mean. They're two not very pleasant words, the technocratic paradigm. What he means by the word paradigm is, I suppose, applying one way of thinking to everything. Applying one very particular way of thinking and of proceeding, and applying it out of context to everything in life. And if that leaves you a bit puzzled, don't worry about it. We will explain that at some length. I hope it will become clear. But the other word, technocratic, not a much used word in the English language. Technocrat. A technocrat is somebody, a ruler who uses his or her technical expertise to run society. That's what a technocrat is. Sometimes you could do with a good technocrat to run a society as complicated as ours, but Francis is talking about a situation that he sees at large in the Western world, in which we have applied the language, the procedures, the images of technical control to run the whole of society. And that's what he thinks is the nub of the problem today. That's quite surprising, isn't it? I bet none of you, well, I might be wrong here, maybe you all raise your hands and say, that's exactly what I thought, but, well, hands up, did anybody talk about the technocratic paradigm or anything like it over a sandwich at lunchtime? No. No hands going up here, maybe lots going on at home, but we didn't come up with that. So there's something a little bit surprising for most of us then. Maybe that's an invitation to open our ears and just try and hear what Francis is trying to tell us. It's a great encyclical, not always very easy to read, but let's just try and get our heads around this little paragraph that I put on the screen here from Laudato Si. He's talking about the subject, in other words, a human being in this kind of society, a technocratic human being. This subject makes every effort to establish the scientific and experimental method, which in itself is already a technique of possession, mastery, and transformation. Okay? That's probably quite a controversial thing to say, that science and its methods and its procedures are all about possession, control, manipulation. You know, some would say, well, it's about a sort of innocent knowledge of how the world works. It's about curiosity and discovery. Think of all the wonderful things that science has done. And actually, Francis wouldn't disagree with that. He says very clearly, science is a wonderful gift to human beings. He's not in any way against science, so please don't take that away from today's thoughts. The wonderful thing about Laudato Si is it's one of the first wonderful examples of the Church engaging in a very deep way with the scientific community and dialoguing to try and understand the world that we live in. But you can take a scientific way of thinking and apply it out of its context. And he thinks, and I've got a feeling he's onto something, that that is incredibly destructive. And we'll find out why. Carry on, though, with this paragraph. It is as if the subject were to find itself in the presence of something formless, completely open to manipulation. We lay our hands on things, attempting to extract everything possible from them, while frequently ignoring or forgetting the reality in front of us. Now that's a really interesting and suggestive sentence. I've got a feeling this goes so deep in us, you might be wondering, well, what's wrong with that? I mean, he's talking about all sorts of things. He could be talking about mining in the Amazon. You know, what do you see when you see the Amazon forest? Do you see incredible biodiversity? Do you see a beautiful jungle? Or do you see a whole lot of stuff that we can use? We can cut down the trees and make it into furniture, or burn it for biomass, and we can mine the ground to get the copper out of it and the other elements that we need for our mobile phones and for coal and for whatever else. And we can use the land to graze livestock so that we can have nice beef burgers for our dinner. What do you see when you look at something like the Amazon rainforest? That's a really important question. The technocratic paradigm sees stuff to use. It's very ugly, isn't it? But honestly, I collude in that. I've got lots of stuff, and a lot of it comes from mines and farms and all the rest of it. So I'm not innocent of this. And Pope Francis isn't saying we shouldn't mine or cut down trees. He's not saying that. He's talking about, what do you see? What paradigm do you apply to looking at God's creation? Think again about, and I'm going to touch on one of those controversial items today that gets people's blood pressure rising, but I'm not going to go into it in any depth. But again, what do you see when you see the male-female structure of humanity? Is that kind of hardwired into us? Is it part of the structure, the logic of creation? Or is it just more stuff, as it were, to twist and use for our own purposes and our own designs? Something about the technocratic paradigm and the way in which we constantly hear today that gender is fluid and everything can be whatever you want it to be. And the Catholic Church is really just saying, well, there's a structure to creation which you've got to try and understand. Obviously, when it comes to looking at a human being, it's very easy to instrumentalize a human being in all sorts of ways, isn't it? What is this person? Just a resource, that wonderful word, human resources. Sounds as though I've got a cupboard full of human limbs, which I can just, we're not resources, we're persons. We can use each other, of course we can. It goes on all the time. But a technocratic paradigm is systematically going to use people, to deny their personhood, to treat people as numbers and not names. Do you have that experience these days of finding more and more your life is you are being treated as a number? I just look back on the past week. I don't want to share too much of my tawdry life with you, but I found myself at an airport, I'm afraid, earlier this week. My flight was cancelled, and I was totally on my own. I don't mean I wanted my mummy there to hold my hand and make everything better, but would it be nice if there'd been a human being to say, well, don't worry, we'll put you on another flight, or here's what to do, go and buy a ticket over there. Everything was online. Absolutely everything was online. Well, you might say, well, thank goodness, very convenient. And of course, the reason that we buy into this is because it is tremendous convenience. The amount of money and time that it saves being mechanized. But what effect does it have on you when you're treated like a machine? I know it makes me really angry. You too? Yeah, some of you are nodding. Yeah? It makes me really angry. And that's an important experience. Not a bad experience, it's a kind of very natural experience. I'm trying to get some visas from the Home Office. And the system you've got in order to apply for the capacity for the visas is every morning there are 60 places available on this website. And you have to send an email so that it arrives between 9 o'clock and 9:01. Well, of course, you've got no idea how long an email is going to take. It could be just 1 second, or it could be 2 minutes, or it could be 4 hours. So again, you're paralyzed. You're treated like a part of a machine, and it makes you feel impotent and angry. This is one of the things that the technocratic paradigm does to all of us, and it's a result of this treating of the world and of people and of animals and of creation as stuff to be manipulated and used, denying its own value and logic and structure. It's a bit of an abstract idea, and some of you will be thinking, gosh, that's quite hard to grasp. But I just invite you to stay with that thought. Maybe we can talk about it later, but I've got a feeling that's quite an important aspect of all our experience of being alive today. Time is just unstructured stuff, minute after minute. We forget about the seasons, we forget about the patterns of human life and the rhythms of the human body. You can have tropical fruit available during the winter. All of these things, it's all a way of just homogenizing time and space and the world we live in. It's very, very dehumanizing. Francis ends this paragraph, I think, with an astonishing and beautiful image. Human beings and material objects no longer extend a friendly hand to one another. The relationship has become confrontational. And in another passage, he uses the image of human beings as sort of wringing out the world, the created world, in order to satisfy their appetites and desires for minerals, resources, whatever it is. I think this is a really important insight of Pope Francis. It's not totally unprecedented in the life of the Church. It builds on various insights of 20th century philosophy, which some of you might be in tune with, but we don't need to go into at the moment. It isn't anti-modern in the sense that he hates the modern world, but he's pretty pessimistic about the modern world and very aware that this way of thinking, this way of approaching reality, this way of shaping human life is extremely hostile to human life, to human dignity, and of course, therefore, to the proclamation of the gospel. Let's think of some of the characteristics of technocratic thinking, and again, I think you will recognize these in your life. Regulation rather than cultural change. There's a problem. Well, could be lots of problems. Bad food coming into the country, social issues, the abuse of people. What's the best way of addressing these problems? These days, you don't really try and change people's behaviour, you issue new rules. Yeah? That's what we do, isn't it? We demand, if there's a problem, that the government issue new legislation requiring usually other people, hopefully not us, people to take action and to make their goods in a certain way, or to go through certain procedures when they're recruiting people. Whatever it is, procedures, regulations, that's the way that we handle problems. And you might say, well, that's a very good thing. And of course, it is in a society like ours. It's really essential. It's very important that there are food safety rules in our country. I'm not against that. But push it too far, apply it to too many sorts of things, and you start treating people like machines. So what does a machine do when it's got a list of tick boxes? It ticks them. And it doesn't really go in here. It doesn't lead to any change of heart. It doesn't change the culture of a place. We know that we fill that form. We know we've got that policy. It's in the big book on the third shelf up there. No one's ever going to look at it, but there you are. We've done the paperwork. So much a part of contemporary ways of doing things. One of my Jesuit brothers uses the word demoralizing to talk about exactly that. In the real sense, it takes away any morality, any morale, any sense of responsibility for the world we live in. And we know what a hell we create when we're dealing with some official in an office who's not wanting to help us, and the computer says no, and they cross their arms, but they're fulfilling the letter of the law because that's what we all know what that's like. Maybe we've even done it at times. Technocratic paradigm. Quantitative analysis. If you can't count it or weigh it or measure it, it doesn't really exist. Sorry about that. That's how the technocratic paradigm works. We're not interested in feelings or qualities of things, but we are interested in counting them. All sorts of things you can't really count. Think of the woman in the gospel scene. Think of the hostility towards Jesus. Think of all of those things. They're entirely qualitative, and most of the important things in our lives are qualitative things that we can't measure. But in the technocratic paradigm, if we can't measure it, it just doesn't exist, it doesn't count. And that's, it seems to me, profoundly problematic for human beings. Again, a real difficulty. Abstraction. So moving out of the concrete into sort of 15 feet off the ground, thinking about things in a very abstract way. That's very typical of technocratic thinking. And then, of course, instrumentalization. Using things, using people in order to make things happen. Using people is the worst thing we can do, isn't it? To use people to fulfill our objectives. It comes back again to that denial of personhood. I'm not treating you as an end in yourself. I'm not treating you as a child of God. I'm not treating you as a uniquely valuable manifestation of God's creativity and love. I'm treating you as a number to make me think that a lot of people came to my talk. Well, there you are. I mean, that's one very simple way of instrumentalizing people. The church can instrumentalize people in the same way. Oh yeah, we've got lots of people paying so much money into the collection. I'm not saying money isn't important. Certainly not saying having a good number of people in the congregation isn't important. But it's very easy to turn the body of Christ into something technocratic in our day and age. On the whole, the Catholic Church isn't too bad in that, but there are some manifestations of that in other churches which you look at and are quite scary. We've got 13,000 people coming and they're making all this money, and we can measure it. It's very technocratic kinds of thinking. I said I'm not an expert in any of this and that I will refer you to a book. If you don't do anything after this talk other than this, then you will have had a useful hour with me. The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist. Rowan Williams, who you might have heard of, former Archbishop of Canterbury, one of the brightest theological minds in the last few centuries, says that this is reported as saying this was the most important book he ever read, and he's read quite a lot of books. I'm now taking us a little bit away from Pope Francis, but trying to give you a sense that what Francis is talking about is actually grounded in real science and some very respectable philosophy. Ian McGilchrist is alive. He's producing books, and you will see plenty of interesting videos on YouTube, online, if you're interested. I think he is the single most interesting person at the moment commentating, analysing, diagnosing what's going on in our technocratic society today. But rather than come at it as sort of cultural critique in the way that Francis does, he's interested in brain science. This is where I'm going to be massively out of my depth, folks, so don't please take anything I say as gospel or terribly accurate. And if we've got any brain surgeons in the group, please don't just put your hands up and say, what a load of nonsense, unless you want to come and explain it yourself. But Gilchrist's theory is actually fairly straightforward. And you might think, oh, I've heard this before. He's interested in the way in which the human brain, in fact, even animal brains, have two hemispheres. There's a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere. That's not a terribly new thought. In fact, it was a thought that did the rounds in the 1960s and 70s and led to all sorts of rather spurious self-help books in those days about, are you right-brained or left-brained? The idea being that if you were right-brained, then you were very poetic and very expressive, and if you were left-brained, you were very analytical and all the rest of it. That's not really terribly helpful, to be honest, and Ian McGilchrist would be the first to criticise all of that. His theory is a lot more up-to-date and a lot more interesting than that, because he doesn't say there is such a thing as being a left-brained or a right-brained person. Guess what? We've all got two hemispheres to our brain. But where he is really, really interesting, I think, is in saying that that has very, very significant implications for the ways in which we perceive reality. And I just want to talk you through that in as simple a way as I can, always checking that I understand it as well. Imagine that you are a bird. There you are, already quite a tricky counterfactual imagination exercise. You need two kinds of attention. You need to be able to do two attentive acts, as it were, at the same time. For one thing, you might be looking at the ground, looking for seeds, something to eat, yeah? and you can be looking to distinguish the seeds from the bits of stone or the grass or whatever it is, and you'll be able to identify the seeds and eat them, right? So it's very focused attention on stuff that isn't moving, that's very easy to control, and that you know exactly what you're looking for. Very important if you're going to eat. On the other hand, if that's the only kind of attentiveness that you're capable of in the world, then you're going to be very vulnerable. Because there are all sorts of bad things out there that might want to eat you. So you also need a kind of attentiveness that's open to the entire horizon of your being, of your perspective. It's relational because it's looking for moving things, which might be your partner, and I'm really out of my depth here, I don't know if birds have partners, so there you are, or your baby birds, or a bigger bird that's going to eat you. It's going to be interested in living things that might pose a threat or that might be a really important relationship to you. Those two kinds of attention are totally different. One is focused, one is open. One is looking very, very closely at dead things or inert, inanimate things. The another is open to the whole world of moving life. And I could go on and contrast those. Fortunately, because we have two hemispheres, living beings, and in a special way human beings, are capable of both those types of consciousness at the same time. You can do that, can't you? Both focused exercises, counting beans, typing in something into the computer, doing your accounts, and at the same time doing something that's open to, can I call it rather pretentiously, the other people, relationships, the mystery of the universe, even poetry, stuff that takes me away from everything that's kind of focused and analytical and manipulatory. That's not a word, but there you are. Do you get the picture? Now, the right hemisphere is the one that does all this openness to otherness. It engages with a kind of rich three-dimensional world full of living beings and is open to things that it doesn't know, like enemies or new friends. The left hemisphere is the one that does small, focused exercises about manipulation, control, counting stuff. Are you beginning to see a little bit about the technocratic paradigm here? Yeah, the left is very technocratic, it is the technocrat. Whereas the right is a bit more open, a bit more holistic. Now where Gilchrist is really interesting and original is he says there is a natural hierarchy between these two hemispheres. And he gives very good scientific reasons for saying that. It's not just a nice thing to say. I leave you to study that. He says the right hemisphere is the one in overall charge, the one that gives the rich three-dimensional horizon picture. And every now and again it will ask the left brain to perform some rather uninteresting but important task necessary for its survival, like finding seeds to eat, or identifying the best bargain on Amazon, or whatever it might be, something quite dry and analytical. That's the natural hierarchy of things. And if you live in a society where that hierarchy is observed, on the whole, you'll live in a fairly decent, civilized, ordered world. But what has happened, he says, in the last few hundred years, and it's crept up on us and is now at critical level, is that hierarchy has slipped into reverse. And in a very sinister way, to be honest, the left brain has taken over. The book's called The Master and His Emissary. The master is the right brain, the emissary, the subject, the servant is the left brain. That relationship has inverted. And we're living in a world more and more where everything that the right brain values and does is becoming inferior and subject to the whim and the way of functioning of the left brain. Okay? And this is where me, sitting at the airport, scratching my forehead, hoping that I might be able to get online to get home in time to give this talk, that in the old days, there's a little bit of relationship, a little bit of But no, now I'm just part of a giant machine. And we all feel, I think, more and more like that. I mean, this is a cultural move of significant dimensions, which has been creeping up on us for a long, long time. Any of you who've ever studied philosophy will come across a man called Descartes. Yeah? One of the really important moments, McGilchrist thinks, when the left hemisphere starts to make itself felt, to throw its weight around. Descartes thought that animals were just machines. If you cut off a cat's leg, well, it doesn't feel pain, it doesn't have a soul, it doesn't experience anything. It might scream or yelp, but that's okay. That's not like human pain and experience, because Descartes thought only human beings have sort of soul, spirit type things. So animals and machines, that's a profoundly left-brain way of thinking. Mechanical, inert, free of feeling. Let's have a quick look at the words that I've put here, just in case I've left any out. So we've got the right brain, broad attention to context of environment, relationship with other peers, but I would say also with other animals, living beings. It's an open and dynamic hemisphere. It's open to creative possibilities. It's open-ended. It's not closed and turned in on itself. And it's holistic. It sees the big picture. The left hemisphere is focused attention on what's known to be important. It's about manipulation. I don't mean that in a moral sense, though it could be that too. It's focused on inanimate objects. It sees a flat, two-dimensional world. It's fixed, it's a closed system, and it's reductionist. In other words, everything that you would associate with a technocratic paradigm, Pope Francis's language. Do you see that McGilchrist is filling in rich theoretical background to what Pope Francis is talking about the modern world we live in? It's dominated by a particular way of thinking that comes from this side of the brain. And he would say, McGilchrist would say, this is behind all modern alienation we feel, the massive surge in mental health problems that our young people are facing because they've been treated like machines since they were born, more or less. And obviously it has obvious consequences in terms of the environmental disaster that we are currently facing. So I think there's a real harmony between what Pope Francis is saying and what Ian McGilchrist is talking about. And just think for a moment about the amount of time that you spend engaging with machines instead of people. Not to be judgmental about it, and certainly not judging you, but just you're forced into, whether it's in the gym, whether you're on the internet, which is a massive machine, whether you're enjoying flying your drone, if someone's looking at you through it. You know, I really resent very much the fact I'm on Twitter, and because of some of the things I follow and I'm interested in, on a regular basis I'm invited to view pictures of machines killing human beings. I couldn't imagine that happening a few years ago. But daily I'm seeing videos of Russian soldiers being zapped by a drone. Horrific. Doesn't upset me nearly as much as it should do, because I'm part of this technocratic way of seeing things. I'm guessing most of us don't play computer games. I'm no judgment again if you do or you don't. But certainly that is a phenomenally important part of the experience and reality of a lot of our children and grandchildren. Again, a totally technical way of engaging with the world. And then, of course, just generally, everything is computerized today. I'm sounding a bit like an old fogey, aren't I? Complaining about the video machine, or I'm trying to make a rather more sophisticated and probing point about the kind of world that we're becoming. I like this quotation. I don't go for motivational quotes very much, but look at the way in which the technocratic paradigm has contaminated this person's imagination. You might like it, but I really hate this. I like to imagine, says Brian Selznick, that the world is one big machine. You know, machines never have any extra parts. They have the exact number and type of parts they need. So I figure if the entire world is a big machine, I have to be here for some reason. And that means you have to be here for some reason too. It's kind of funny. I think, to be honest, no disrespect to the gentleman in question, but do you see how motivational, actually quite a humanistic sentiment that we all have our place in creation has been turned into a mechanical image, which I don't know about you, but it makes my skin crawl. You're all wincing. Anyway, I didn't mean to cause you discomfort. I think I've made the point. This is the nub of the hostility in the modern world. I try and root some of this in Scripture, and I couldn't help noticing that this famous passage from Matthew, back from the Psalms, which we sing every Easter night, don't we? The stone which the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Should we all sing that together? No, let's not sing it together, but you've all sung it, I'm sure, in your parish. The stone which the builders rejected, left brain, a group of builders inspecting a group of stones to see which ones they're going to put into the new building, and they reject one because it isn't the right shape. Very left-brained. Well, that stone has become the cornerstone, the basis for a new building that no one could have imagined because it's unexpected and surprising. This is the world of the right brain. I don't think for 1 minute Jesus or the psalmist or St. Matthew had that thought, but it's quite striking that this really important quotation from the Bible, to my mind, captures exactly the idea that the Easter message is somehow the affirmation of right brain thinking over a sort of rather focused, negative left brain approach. I've made my main point. I've got about 20 minutes left, and we're going to talk a little bit quicker about these remaining points, if that's okay. I want to talk about discernment. Why? Because that's what the right brain does. One of its ways of knowing the reality around us. It's not by analysing or conceptualising or counting or measuring. It's by intuition. It's by feeling. It's by broad awareness. All sorts of ways that, to be honest, we're not often taught in the educational system today. I was talking to an educationalist just yesterday, and he was telling me that the government has been trying to get poetry out of the curriculum. Shocking, isn't it? Again, I'm sounding like a real old fogey, but this is precisely the kind of issue, I think, that comes up when you realise that the technocratic paradigm is the nub of the hostility. We should be campaigning not just for refugees and for freedom of speech, but for more poetry. Because poetry opens up the mystery of a world. It uses metaphor and images that you can't pin to the ground and say, this is what they mean. They make another world open and available to us. Ultimately, they make the mystery of God available to us, because God usually uses poetic imagery and metaphor to make himself known. So what is discernment? This is so important if we're going to become a synodal church. We've got to enter into spiritual discernment. The basic idea is very simple, and you will have got it from Tom and Jerry cartoons of old. There isn't anybody who doesn't know what a Tom and Jerry cartoon is. We talk about that afterwards. There's a little angel on one side and a little demon on the other shoulder, and from time to time they propose ideas to us. In a very simple moralistic way, you can imagine the angel saying, help that old lady to cross the road, that's a nice idea. Or the demon would be, have another chocolate cake, or push that person around. Okay, well that's sort of 101, I guess, discernment. But it gets a little bit more interesting than that. Little quotation here from the autobiography of St. Ignatius. Ignatius learned by experience that one train of thought left him sad, and the other joyful. This was his first reasoning on spiritual matters. Afterwards, when he began the spiritual exercises, he was enlightened and understood what he later taught his children about the discernment of spirits. Gradually, he recognized the different spirits by which he was moved. One, the Spirit of God, and the other, the devil. So spiritual discernment, first and foremost, is listening out for what the Spirit, the good Spirit, is saying, and also being aware of what the bad Spirit is saying. We don't often do that, do we? I just like to give you my ideas, my opinions. I don't Unlike Ignatius, I don't pay much attention to the way that makes me feel, whether it makes me feel a bit sad, or whether I'm sort of built up in hope and faith and love. We're talking there about the question of awareness. Awareness is right-brained experience. Awareness of our feelings. For all sorts of reasons, we are more and more suppressing the experience of our feelings. We run away from difficult feelings by all the old ways and a few new ones too. Loneliness. When was the last time you felt lonely? Oh, I've never felt lonely. Well, actually, I felt lonely. And one of the ways I deal with loneliness is to distract myself with another YouTube video or a bit of drink. I know this isn't confession. But, these are the ways we get away from those difficult feelings. Awareness helps us just to know what they are, and then we don't have to run away from them. Also, awareness of our thoughts. That thought came to me, and I didn't notice, but that thought really raised my morale. It might be the thought that I'm going to have a holiday next week. Or it might be an idea about who Jesus Christ is. I bet this morning, as we worked through the gospel, I bet at least some of you felt moved in some way, an increase in faith, hope and love. And we call those spiritual movements, when something in us moves. And it can be a move into joy, peace and tranquility, and it can also be a movement into despair, hopelessness and sadness. Discernment means noticing all of that. I say that we won't be a good synodal church unless we discern, because what I see at the moment is we all get together in a group and we all say what we want to say, and it's good stuff. But I don't notice at the moment too many groups saying, and how did that leave us, individually and as a group? You can spot what we call consolation, I'll come to that in a second, because it lifts the group, it makes them hopeful, it binds them together, signs of the Spirit at work. But you can also notice the opposite, when somebody says something and I think, oh, there she goes again, same old nonsense, and you just notice that sense of unity fading away. Or somebody says something and the energy goes out. Don't judge all of that. Don't say that the person who said that was wrong or bad, but do notice what's happening in the group. I said we'd come back to dear old Rubens and just have a look at that picture again. Just to be aware of, well, what are the feelings? What are the emotions going on there? We looked at the group of disciples before, and what I notice is tremendous focus, stillness, actual just attentiveness. Whereas on the other side, the 2/3, I notice huge amounts of movement, which is lovely. I love movement, and swirls and swishes of beautiful satin robes and sumptuous banquets being brought in, and people looking in all sorts of different directions, all over the place. They're totally distracted. Totally distracted. There's no focus at all. I think that says an awful lot. Rubens knew something about maybe the right brain and the left brain, but certainly about the way in which the spirits operate. The good spirit draws us in unity, focus, clarity of purpose. The bad spirit is, oh, let's go and do that. No, I think I'll do this instead. Dissipation of effort, no direction. Yeah? Ignatius has the language of consolation and desolation to talk about these things. Consolation is when we're brought into a relationship with Christ. We have an increase in faith, hope, and in love. Usually it's a positive experience in the sense of being associated with things like joy and happiness and peace. But it isn't the same as happiness. Sometimes in a group you'll find somebody says something quite difficult, quite confrontational. We're forgetting the poor in everything that we're talking about here. What about the people out there on the street, homeless? And that doesn't make us feel happy, but suddenly the group is galvanized and draws together and does something. That's consolation. When I weep because I'm sorry for my sins. That's not comfortable. It's not nice to talk about my sins or to think about them, but it draws me into deeper relationship with Christ. That's consolation. So consolation isn't just cheeriness and happiness. In fact, it can look very, very different. It can be associated with tears, pain, and all sorts of things. But the point is, it draws me into that relationship. Desolation is the opposite. It's anything that draws me away from Christ, a decrease of faith, hope, and love. And it can be experienced in sadness and even depression, but it's not the same as sadness and depression. In fact, one of the characteristic desolations of people in religious life is that we're having a great time eating and drinking, and we're all very comfortable and everything's fantastic, but we don't pray anymore. We don't do our work very well. We don't really bother with our community interaction. That's just desolation. And so the spiritual life starts to decay. Desolation isn't just about sad-looking things. It can be a bunch of villains on the way to some debauched, drunken experience, and they feel great, but that's not consolation. It's a kind of desolation. Ignatius is really interesting about those things. He uses the experiences of consolation and desolation to help us to reflect on what God wants for us. Desolation isn't a bad thing to have. We all have it. The thing isn't to say, oh no, I'm in desolation, there's a terrible problem. No, I'm in desolation, okay. Let's see why. What's going on here? And then a good spiritual director or accompanier will help us to make sense of it, to move through the experience. Going a bit too fast here, aren't I, to say quite deep things, but this is how we need to be if we're going to function in the hostile environment that we're in. I quite like this. I'll just read this quotation from Evangelii Gaudium, because Francis has this notion that there's a particular kind of desolation that can afflict parishes. This isn't a judgment of your parish, which I don't know at all, but just, I think he's got a real insight. The problem is not always an excess of activity. In fact, I know some parishes where that isn't a problem at all. But rather, activity undertaken badly, without adequate motivation, without a spirituality which would permeate it and make it pleasurable. Imagine some project that your parish has decided to commit itself to, whether it's in catechesis or social justice or interreligious dialogue or whatever it is that you've decided to do. As a result, work becomes more tiring than necessary, even lending at times to illness. Far from a content and happy tiredness, this is a tense, burdensome, dissatisfying, and in the end, unbearable fatigue. This pastoral acedia, which was the old patristic name for what we call desolation now, can be caused by a number of things. And he goes through a list of them. I won't bore you with them. Well, they're not boring, they're really interesting, but I'll leave you to discover those if you think this is relevant to you. I like the way he even discerns his fatigue. That's a really good exercise. Yeah, there's a really good fatigue. If you've been working hard, doing great things, and there's that gentle glow as you go to bed. Wow, what a wonderful, blessed day. But I'm exhausted. Go straight out. And then there's another kind of fatigue, which is, I can't bear this anymore. I can't face that awful person or that group or that problem. Oh, I'm so oppressed. Again, consolation, desolation. Listen to that. Discern your fatigue. Understand what's going on. Francis is very, very wise. There's also this thing called forced consolation, which I don't want to talk about too much, but sometimes we feel moved to do something beautiful and good, and in fact, in a strange way, it leads us away from Jesus. Sometimes the bad spirit operates as an angel of light, says Ignatius, drawing us in an apparently good direction, which turns out to be either a distraction, a false good, or a lesser good. Look out for the serpent's tail, he says. Sometimes a good chain of thought actually ends up with a little display of evil, nastiness. What could he be talking about? I suppose, imagine again a parish group that's decided to do something wonderful, but modest, because there isn't a lot of energy around, or you don't have a lot of money to do something bigger, and you've all come to a consensus that leaves you all in peace and harmony, and then somebody suddenly comes in and says, you can do something much bigger and better than that. Look at this. Yeah? And of course, it's bigger and better, so you all think this is the Holy Spirit speaking. But you just notice that actually it has some quite sinister effects. Breaks down the solidarity of the group, which was so precious, but you didn't notice it. You all start now going off in different directions. Some of you break off into factions, and suddenly you see what's going to happen. You're going to have an anti and a pro faction in your parish. Bitterness, resentment, a lot of you are nodding. I'm not from this parish, I'm sure. But actually, this is just human. Discernment is always looking for the possibility that what looks like a lovely consolation might actually be far more destructive. Because the enemy doesn't have many tricks to play. His wiles are pretty predictable, but one of the things he can do every now and again is throw in a curveball and attract us to what looks good but actually isn't. That's why we call him Lucifer, the light bearer. Yeah? He can look good sometimes. Back to Rubens. The false goods. Haven't really talked about that peacock, have I? I love the peacock. Can you all see it at the top? Just slightly to the left of the centre. The peacock is a symbol of eternal life in classical painting. And here the peacock is dead and stuffed, poor thing, on a platter. Interesting, isn't it, that the way of thinking of the scribes here turns something beautiful and life-giving into a flat, dead thing. Exactly what the left brain does. Clever old Rubens once again. What seems like a beautiful thing, peacock, actually turns out to be misleading. That was quite important in Ignatius's life too. He once had a vision of what was probably a peacock. He describes it as a serpent with many eyes, but that's almost certainly a peacock that he's talking about. And that is also a symbol of vainglory, because of course a peacock looks great with his beautiful tail. And Ignatius's great sin, his mother's sin if you like, was the sin of vainglory. He wanted to look really good, and that's a sin that he struggled all his life with. Of course, vainglory can sometimes look as though it's a good thing to buy into. Something very sinister there. I want, in the tiny molecule of time left to me, to say something about the revolution of tenderness, non-violence. You'd have heard Pope Francis has said that the death penalty has no place anymore in the state's activities, shouldn't take place. Very controversial, some people say. Look, it's in the teaching of the past, we mustn't betray the deposit of the faith. Well, it's quite interesting that he thinks that today the death penalty is just unnecessary in Western society. You can always lock people up to protect society, and the punitive revenge-bearing aspect of punishment is not something he has a great deal of time for. Other ways in which he is constantly appealing to non-violence. There's a question about whether non-violence, which is different from pacifism, by the way, it's not quite the same, whether non-violence might actually become a sort of stated policy of the Church's social teaching. And certainly there are some things he's saying which are pointing in that direction. This was his message for the World Day of Peace in 2017. Jesus himself lived in violent times, yet he taught that the true battlefield, where violence and peace meet, is the human heart. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intention comes, quotation from Jesus. But Christ's message in this regard offers a radically positive approach. He unfailingly preached God's unconditional love, which welcomes and forgives. He taught his disciples to love their enemies and to turn the other cheek. When he stopped her accusers from stoning the woman caught in adultery, And when on the night before he died he told Peter to put away his sword, Jesus marked out the path of non-violence. He walked that path to the very end, to the cross, whereby he became our peace and put an end to hostility. Whoever accepts the good news of Jesus is able to acknowledge the violence within and be healed by God's mercy, becoming in turn an instrument of reconciliation. In the words of St. Francis of Assisi, as you announce peace with your mouth, make sure that you have greater peace in your hearts. Well, worth going to that beautiful and inspiring message about non-violence in the world. It's a little indication. He's sort of flying a kite just to see what the reaction to that is. And there is a big part of the church in some parts of the world which finds this deeply disturbing. This fixation on non-violence doesn't fit with the idea of a God who is in fact quite violent. Jesus' message, is it a message of non-violence? I think that gospel passage that we explored earlier on suggested yes. He's not violent in that. He's brutally honest. He's happy to enter into confrontation, but he doesn't coerce anybody. He doesn't abuse anybody. He certainly doesn't strike anybody. I wonder if there's something there that's also to do with the left and the right brain. I'm not sure there. I haven't made the connection very clearly in my own mind, but I've got a feeling a lot of our violence today comes from the way in which this left brain culture that we all live in makes us angry, alienates us, breaks down communities, breaks down self-confidence, turning us more into this alienated thing that just doesn't feel at home in the modern world. I've got a feeling that makes us angry and violent. I think Francis is showing us another possibility and asking us just to stay with our awareness of who we are and where we are, and to ask that question of whether another kind of world is possible. That's my input for today. I've kept incredibly well to time, which is a very technocratic thing to do, I'm afraid. But there you are. Just proves the point. I'm happy to stay on for any questions that anybody has, and happy to hear anything from online, but obviously if people need to go as well, in a demonstration of your hostility, then don't hesitate to do that. Thank you. So, yes, we got the microphone on its way.
Yeah, I actually thought this was so brilliant, I wrote it down. So you're talking about the Ignatian idea of consolation.
Yes.
I'm familiar with the exercises, so when you said I weep because I'm sorry for my sins,
yes.
I've also very, very inspired, and have been all my life, by Newman's Dream of Gerontius poem.
Yes.
And I was wondering whether you could comment on that with regard to that and the pain of purgatory. The older I get, the more I sort of think about how my selfish actions as a teenager hurt the people I love.
Yes.
And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, when I die and if I go to purgatory, I'm going to find that really, really hard.
Yes.
But this helps a bit. I just wondered if you could comment.
Very happy to. Again, discern your guilt, folks. This is really important. First of all, don't believe everybody who says, oh, guilt's totally useless, very bad thing. No, guilt can be a very good thing indeed. And a Catholic, above all, should know a bit about guilt. But at the same time, we all know that sometimes the experience of guilt can be paralysing. We get totally stuck in it. So discern your guilt. Some guilt comes from the good spirit, and some of it comes from the bad spirit. It's not all the same stuff. How do you know the difference? Well, you've just put it very beautifully. If I can just express it in my own words, maybe not reflecting totally your own experience. If I feel a guilt that's repetitive, same old story, plunges me into despair, moving me away from hope, actually turns me slowly into an old curmudgeon who's closed off from other people because of a sense that my life has gone all wrong and I'm no good, that's not the good spirit, is it? That's guilt that's coming from the bad spirit. If it's guilt that says, oh my word, I've just realised what I said to that person 30 years ago. Oh, that's dreadful. I'm going to put it right straight away. Or I'm never going to do that again. This is going to be a moment of change in my life. That sounds like the good spirit. Yeah? It's a totally different experience. But in our language, we call them both guilt. And then our therapist tells us that guilt is totally bad and inappropriate, or somebody else tells us it's always good and is the voice of God we must always listen to. No, discern. Discern. Really, really important. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I too, we did the exercises.
There's a
Saint Ignatius.
Did you? Oh, good. Sounds as though everybody has it. It's amazing.
What I want to make is that we make decisions all the time.
Yes.
I decided to come here today,
Yes.
for example, small decision.
Yep.
But we also make big decisions. And for that, we need the Holy Spirit, very much indeed.
Yep.
And we have to trust in God that it's going to be all right in the end.
Yes.
But even if we make the wrong decision, God always brings some good out of evil.
Sure.
That's just something that he does.
It's a very, very good point, yes.
Yeah.
And again, that's a thought that brings hope. Because often we don't make the right decision. Does that mean that God decides, right, that's enough for you? You've had your quota of mercy. Finished. It doesn't work like that. Infinite love has a different logic. Yeah, thanks for that. That's really helpful. Any other questions or points that people would like to make? Yes, over here. Just wait for the microphone to come, because we need to hear your point.
Should we be dreadfully worried about AI?
Should we be dreadfully worried about AI? Well, I suppose the answer is yes and no. I mean, I've told you about my areas of expertise, which are very limited indeed, and they certainly don't cover AI. But insofar as more and more we might find ourselves dialoguing with a totally impersonal, mechanically, well, I'm not sure that's the right word, but machine-generated, a lot of verbiage that has simply picked up the entire content of the internet, analysed it and processed it in a certain way, and then feeding it back to us. Is that going to make us feel less like machines? I wouldn't have thought so. Whether worry helps as a strategy, I doubt very much. Anxiety is very rarely... I was talking to someone about anxiety earlier, my own sort of empowering anxiety that always makes me turn up on time for things. Anxiety itself is not always a very positive thing. So I wouldn't be too worried about it, but I think we should be asking ourselves about the way the world is going and about how we, as a worldwide churches, partnership with people of other faiths and of none, might actually start to try and act responsibly in a humane way. And I think Laudato Si is a really good place to start. So much bigger, folks, than recycling and vegetarianism and not using your car and all of those other environmental things that are important. But Francis is talking about something far, far bigger. And I think that's what we need to hear. One more question, and then I think we're off. Yes, sir.
Yes. Start off with a joke from Father Butcher, God rest him. A nun is taking a class of children, and she's talking about Adam and Eve.
Yes.
And one little boy puts his hand up and says, "My dad said we come from monkeys." And the nun turns around and says, "The Murphy family probably do." But taking that seriously now for a moment, if you take Darwin's, not the whole thing, but part of this development up to a certain point, Neanderthal man and all the things that they found and then we have the story of Adam and Eve, and God takes up some dust and blows into it and forms man, and Eve is a rib of Adam. Now, is that an analogy, that story, or how do we discern whether the Neanderthal man had a soul, and before Christ came to be the saviour of us all, was he the saviour of early man?
really, really big questions, out of my domain totally, and certainly not a sort of 2-minute answer.
No.
Really, really good questions. I mean, I can throw a few
Yeah.
scattergun responses in your direction, but
Yeah.
really, really good questions. First of all, Catholics are not literalists, as it were, about the Adam and Eve story.
No.
It's a creation myth. We don't believe that it literally happened like that. That's fine. If any of you are shocked and scandalised by that, I refer you to a biblical scholar who will be able to, doesn't live too far away from you, who will clarify that. It doesn't mean it's not true, and it certainly doesn't mean it's not important. But it's not a literal, quasi-scientific account of where we come from. So you can believe in something like Darwinian evolution and still take the creation story very seriously. And you should. Certainly if you want to understand the rest of Scripture, certainly if you want to understand who Jesus is, you absolutely need the Adam and Eve story. It's part of the same narrative, right? That's the first thing. All those questions about ensoulment. I will only make one point here. For Descartes, if all the animals are really machines, but human beings have souls, and the big question is, where on earth did the soul come from? How did that suddenly appear in the evolutionary history? Nobody's got an answer to that question. The Church has always said, well, there must be something going on here, but we don't quite know what. But it's a mystery. I'm really not an evolutionary biologist. This is so embarrassing. But I think what's happening these days is people are noticing that animals, far from being machines, actually share in an awful lot of the characteristics that we have in a way that we would never have imagined. And again, I keep sending you back to YouTube while at the same time telling you to get off the internet. But you'll see all sorts of extraordinary things. Animals making decisions, being manipulative, strategic in their thinking, in ways that we simply a few decades ago thought was totally impossible. So this whole question of the relationship between human beings and animals, I've got a feeling needs to be addressed in a different way today. And again, believe it or not, those thoughts are in Laudato Si too. So thanks for all of that, and I'm sorry I put on a wonderful talk about ensoulment in evolution, and that will sort it out. Okay. I think we're done, folks. Thank you very much indeed. I've really enjoyed that.